This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Canada's iconic wildlife includes moose, beavers, and wolves. But of the many species of vertebrate here, which are the most evolutionarily distinct? And why does that matter? A team of researchers from Simon Fraser University explored these questions in their paper, Evolutionary Isolation of Canadian Terrestrial Vertebrate Species, published in the journal The Canadian Field-Naturalist. The final list included some not-so-surprising results, like beavers being near the top of the list for mammals, and some unusual species that aren't commonly known, like mudpuppies, an amphibian that can be found in a relatively small range of southern Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. To share more about the paper, how the species lists were developed, and why it's important for conservationists to learn about them, study co-author Emma Kominek joins Defender Radio. The most common sense place to start this conversation is about what is evolutionary distinctiveness, because I think everyone understands what it means to be distinct and what it means to have evolved, but how do those two words kind of go together to create the basis of the conversation that we're going to have and the study that you worked on?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely not a term that I think many people have heard of before. But evolutionary distinctiveness is essentially looking at the relatedness between species on a tree of life. It's asking, I guess, how related each species is to another on that tree, and pretty much identifying the loneliest species on these trees of life, the species that branched off from everything else a really long time ago and don't have very few close relatives. And we consider these to be the most evolutionarily distinct species because there's really nothing else like them on the tree.
Yeah, and it's a very cool idea to look at this. Again, it's one of those, I'm sure people have talked about it in the past, but seeing it presented as an article, reading the article in Canadian Field-Naturalist, and also SFU published an article that was quite good as well. It really helped kind of understand that there is, and we forget the diversity that exists in Canada. So this is a very cool way to look at it. When we're talking about the evolutionary distinctiveness, how are we measuring that? Is it a phylogenetic thing? Is it looking at a certain pattern?
Yeah, so we're using phylogenetic trees. So for our study, we focused on Canadian trees of life. So we took global trees of life that have previously been created by a research team at Yale University and prune those down to only contain species that were found here in Canada. And with those Canadian trees of life, we were able to kind of map the relatedness of species across Canada, basically looking at, well, how many close relatives do each species in Canada share? And if you were to follow that species to where they connect the rest of Canada's tree of life, how far into that tree would you have to travel? And those two answers allowed us to create a measure in millions of years of how much evolutionary history or how much of Canada's trees of life do these species not share with other species in Canada, or in other words, how many years of our tree of life here in Canada or of irreplaceable evolutionary history would be lost if these species were to disappear from Canada.
Well, and I guess that leads nicely into that next question of why is it important to understand this diversity? And again, it's the appreciation of conservation, but I will ask as devil's advocate, sort of the so what, who cares? If moose suddenly weren't on Newfoundland roads anymore, there would be a lot of people happy in Newfoundland, I think, but it wouldn't be good for the ecosystem. What is the importance of understanding and of preserving that distinct genetic heritage?
Yeah, I think foundational theory for this work started a few years ago when the UN made a statement saying that a goal for current conservation work should be to prioritize preserving as much of the tree of life as possible to keep life on Earth as diverse as possible. And so this evolutionary distinctiveness metric kind of gives us a tool to make sure we're actually able to achieve that goal, right? To kind of give us a guideline of how we can make sure that we are actually conserving the tree of life, because these distinct species that we're identifying represent really large portions of the tree of life that no other species can replace. And if they disappear, those large chunks would disappear with them. And because they've been so isolated for so long and they're so lonely, these distinctive species are expected to be very unique. They're expected to look a little different than other species, interact with their environment a little different than other species. And because of this, they are most likely having these characteristics or even ecosystem roles that are not replaceable by other species. Our study focused on identifying Canada's most distinctive species. So a lot of these species have irreplaceable functions in Canada's ecosystems. And so if they were to disappear, so would those really important ecosystem functions would be as well.
Yeah, and it's, as I noted, we easily forget how diverse Canada is in terms of our biomass. We've got so many different things, and I think part of it is because, unlike a lot of other nations, we live in very small, comparatively, communities to the geography of the country. Right? Like you can look at the map and see it's like, oh, well, there's Vancouver, there's Calgary, there's Edmonton, and you see those city centers along sort of that 49th parallel, and then there's not a lot of density north. So we don't see a lot. And we do have dense vegetation between. In looking at the lists, there were two that didn't surprise me, and we're going to get, I mean, I know this is the fun part. The two, I mean, for me, knowing there would be a turtle on the list made sense, because I know all of our turtles are endangered, which indicates there's some issues there, and the Virginia opossum, because as amazing as they are, they're really weird, right? Like, scientifically speaking, they're odd. So it makes sense that they're there. But again, we forget so much about the number of amphibians and reptiles and things like that that call Canada home. When you looked at this list, when you kind of you finished it and you pulled up what I imagine is the world's largest Excel spreadsheet of some kind, which animals were the ones that were surprising to you over the others?
Yeah, I think the points you made were kind of what we were thinking, right? We knew that the opossum, being the only marsupial here in Canada, would rank really high, but for the rest of it, like, yeah, turtles are going to rank high. There's not very many of them here. They're a old group in general globally, but which one, right? It was kind of a surprise for all of us, and it was something that we were quite excited to see. Probably our biggest surprise was figuring out who Canada's most evolutionarily distinct species is, and that is the spiny softshell turtle. This is a freshwater turtle species that is found in southwestern Ontario. They have this really soft, leathery shell and this really, well, I think really cute, like snout-like nose that they use like a snorkel to kind of breathe out of the water. And unfortunately, they're an endangered species here in Canada and have been endangered for quite a while, but this species represents close to 100 million years of evolutionary history.
Wow.
That is not shared with any other Canadian species.
That's wild. So for 100 million years, they have more or less stayed in one category of genetics. They haven't changed a lot in that long. And for comparison, I'm really not good with my archaeological or anthropological eras. What else was going on for planet Earth 200 million years ago? Like, was there dinosaurs or sort of tromping around still? Are we talking Ice Age? Whereabouts? I mean, those are the two I know. So,
yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that either, but I would say it was pre-Ice Age, and I want to say probably post-dinosaur, but these species aren't necessarily unchanged since then. They just are found on lineages that have evolved to be good enough through this incredible period of time to not go extinct.
Okay.
So they're not necessarily the winners of evolution, I would say. They've just have good enough traits that have gotten them here through everything that has happened in the past millions of years. And so they're usually members of might be the only member of like their family here in Canada, or if you're looking at the global list in the world. Yeah.
It's incredible to put it all into that kind of context. Another one that I feel like I forgot this creature existed until I saw it on the list is the mudpuppy.
Yes.
Another one that is so incredibly distinctive looking that the second you go, it's like, that can't be from Canada. That looks like someone like the Xolotl from Mexico City. Like, it looks more along those lines than anything I've seen wandering around the streets of Hamilton in my time. What is it about some of these, the reptiles, the amphibians that allowed them to continue this trait or to be so distinct genetically?
Yeah, so I would say there's a bunch of different reasons. The mudpuppy was another one of, I think, all of mine and my co-authors' like favorite species on this list. They're a really cool amphibian, Canada's largest salamander species, and they basically Canada's axolotl. They look very similar to an axolotl, and they spend their whole life in the water, unlike any other salamander species here. But I would say, as to what makes them so unique for Canada, it's probably a big reason of that is that we don't have a lot of reptiles and amphibians in our country, right? Most of our country is cold Iceland that reptiles and amphibians don't do well in because they require like sunlight and warmth and the environment to kind of control their body temperature or regulate their body temperature. And so because we have so few and because these groups globally are so old, it gives them the edge, I guess, to represent large portions of Canada's tree of life that no other species share because we don't have a lot of them. So they're going to share big portions of that tree themselves. And then I think it's also that because these species are just so old in general, they, to some extent, have traits that early ancestral amphibians and things do or had, I guess.
It's very cool. And one of the things noted as a surprise was the number of exotic species that ended up on this list. So by exotic species, do we mean those that are not native to Canada or our ecosphere sort of long term? Is that correct?
Yeah, so we kind of did our analyses twice. So the first set of analyses we did was looking at species that are only native to Canada. So these are species that are expected to be found here naturally. And then we also included exotic species for our second set of analyses. So like you said, exotic species are species that have been introduced to Canada via human activity. And, we might have heard like invasive species before. Sometimes they can have quite negative impacts on native wildlife, and sometimes they're able to coexist with the wildlife that we have here. But when we included these species into our Canadian trees of life, we found that many of these species are the only members of their families here in Canada, and some of them actually rank quite high in our distinctiveness ranking lists. For instance, the common wall lizard, which is an introduced species of lizard found on Vancouver Island and southern BC, is the most isolated lizard or snake here in Canada. And it kind of exists with the native most distinct lizard or snake, the northern alligator lizard, and might even be competing for resources with that species.
Wow.
And
so that gets into that impact right away of why does that matter? What does it look like to sort of compare these?
Yeah. And it's also interesting because, some of these species have negative impacts on our ecosystems here, but another invasive or introduced species, the feral horse, would be our second most isolated mammal in Canada. But they have a bit of a positive, I guess, view here. They are a culturally significant species here in Canada. They're an iconic species of Sable Island in Nova Scotia, and they're quite loved by people. So these two examples are kind of on polar opposite ends of what it means to be an introduced species.
Yeah, and I would have expected a lot of them to be insects that have been introduced through horticulture, either intentionally or unintentionally, over the decades and centuries that people have been here and traveling from Europe. Because that's just my experience and my knowledge is based on a lot of that. Like the emerald ash borer just completely devastated forests here because someone brought it over in a little box from Asia, was it 50 years ago? And it managed to get a foothold and wiped out the ash trees of Ontario. So like the impact is very obvious sometimes, but as you said, sometimes it's not as obvious.
Yeah, so that's a good point. For our study, we only looked at terrestrial vertebrates. So these are animals with spines that live on land. And one of the main reasons why we only focused on these groups of species is because we have the data to perform these measurements. Like I said before, they require these phylogenies or tree of life, and there's lots of groups on Earth that don't have a phylogeny created for them yet, insects being one of them. And so it would be really interesting to be able to identify those isolated insects here in Canada and like compare them to the exotic species and see, for instance, if that emerald ash borer would in theory be a really distinctive species here.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you confirm scientifically for me that indeed there are too many types of insects on the planet, because that's been a thing for me this year, is just learning more about insects and going, there's just too many of them.
Yeah.
Overall, too many different, we should have like 5, I think, realistically, but
I think there's over 1 million described species of insects, and that's expected to only be a small portion of the total diversity of insects on Earth. But I think they are a very understudied group, comparatively speaking, to like mammals or birds or reptiles. And so because of that, we just don't have the information that we need to create these phylogenies. The good news is that there is a lot of work being done right now. So recently, we now have a North American phylogeny or tree of life of butterflies. And so we could, in theory, identify who our most distinct butterflies are in North America and in Canada as well. And so we're slowly getting to the part where we can figure out the same information with those less studied groups, but we're definitely still not there yet.
Awesome. Are there any, having gone through your list, having done all this work, are there any animals or species that pop out for you as going, that's maybe where we need to be putting more conservation efforts, and we're simply not? Did anyone jump out at you like that? Or vice versa, we're giving far too much conservation effort to this animal that is not as important in this manner?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that first thing, like where should we be putting a lot of our conservation work, was answered for me through this process. Most of Canada's evolutionarily distinct species are amphibians or reptiles. 9 of the top 10 most isolated species here in Canada, or most distinct species here in Canada, are a reptile or an amphibian. And these groups are also the most at-risk groups of species here in Canada. 7 of those species, the top 10 species here in Canada, are at some level of risk. And, you know, at the time when we did this research a few years ago, 58% of reptiles and amphibians are at some level of risk here in Canada, and that makes up 30% of our land-living vertebrate species here. So this is a group that is incredibly at risk here in Canada, that a lot of populations are dropping quite quickly, and they desperately need conservation attention to. And they're also not your traditional charismatic groups of species that people tend to gravitate towards. So, you know, we really hope that this information, these lists, provide a new perspective on these species and draw some attention to these lesser known species, right? For instance, our most isolated species, our most distinct species, the spiny softshell turtle, is endangered, and it's been endangered here for quite some time. And there's only a really small population left in Canada due to habitat loss and degradation.
Yeah, and I found it interesting. This is very much a thing for the fur bearers in the work we do, but a lot of the animals in the top, so spiny softshell turtle, mudpuppy, northern alligator lizard, belted kingfisher, and pond slider, I believe, although pond slider is exotic, they are all water adjacent creatures. And beaver is one of the top mammals of distinctiveness, and I find it compelling because beavers create and manage the ecosystems that all of these other animals rely on, even though they still are also highly persecuted. So it's just interesting to see some of that connectedness across the array of, again, the reminder of how important wetlands are and that kind of ecosystem that we've gotten real good at filling in and paving over.
Yeah, exactly, right? You mentioned before how these distinct species are expected to represent these habitat roles or traits that are irreplaceable in Canada. And the beavers are a really good example of that. They're our third most distinct mammal here, and they are the only species in Canada that actively build wetlands for all these other species to live in. So they are considered an ecosystem engineer because they do this. And right, if beavers were to disappear, not only would be losing that large portion of the tree of life that they represent that no other species does here, but we would also be losing that engineer, that species that is building homes for all of, and subsequently all of these other isolated species. And it's a little unfortunate, I guess. Like you said before, we have such a big country, but we all live right along the US border for the most part. But that's where most of our wetlands are occupied, and with all of these amphibians and reptiles. And so we're in this really kind of interesting position where a lot of this development is happening, is encroaching on these wetlands, and habitat loss is a major threat for pretty much all of our isolated species because of it.
What's next for research like this? You spoke to there's a work being done on classifying butterflies phylogenetically in this way through the Tree of Life in Canada. Is it doing more of the research to be able to categorize, or is it taking this categorization and applying it in some way?
Yeah, I would say that's kind of a two-part answer, right? The one part for like future work that needs to get done in terms of research, and the other part being conservation-wise. Well, we have these lists. What do we do with them now, pretty much?
Yeah.
In terms of research-wise, there's a few different things that would be really cool to do moving forward. One of them would be to, like you said, continue to create these lists for Canadian species. That's something that I and my advisor, Arne Ø, another co-author on this paper, has kind of started with. I just finished my master's, and we were kind of looking at insects and the evolutionary distinctiveness of insects. And so we have been able to calculate Canada's most isolated butterflies. So it's unpublished right now, but that's kind of a line that hopefully will get published in the future. But kind of beyond that, what about our bees and all of these other insects groups? Yeah. Insects are another groups of species that are facing global declines, both in Canada and globally. And so their conservation attention is desperately needed, but also Canada's plants and other species as well. And it would be also really cool for other countries to make these lists as well. Distinctiveness for global mammals and amphibians and reptiles and a few other groups of species has been made, but most conservation organizations are operating at the national level. So they are really focusing and caring about conserving the wildlife in their country, just like here in Canada. So ours is the first study to calculate national level scores for species in Canada. So hopefully that's helpful for Canadian conservationists, but it'd be really helpful if other countries could do the same for the species in their country for their conservationists, and also be interesting to kind of compare isolated species between countries.
Definitely.
So that's kind of like research-wise, what would be important moving forward and what we want to focus on. But in terms of like what to do now with these lists for conservation action, there's a few different things. I think one thing that I think these lists would be really good for is, like I said before, drawing attention to these lesser known Canadian species that people may not have heard of before, and kind of hopefully encouraging them to care and support efforts to save them, and even potentially changing people's perceptions of some species that tend to have a generally negative reputation. For instance, the snapping turtle is a turtle that I'm sure many people are familiar with. They are the second most distinct turtle here in Canada, but they're also very distinct globally. They fall within the top 20 most, top 20 most isolated turtles in the world. And, you know, people tend to be quite afraid of them. They're quite creepy looking. They're very dinosaurish, and they are also known for snapping to defend themselves. But beyond that, they represent a large portion of Canada's natural history in our tree of life that no other species on Earth shares. And because of this, they're also really valuable to our ecosystems. They are scavengers in the freshwater, like lakes and rivers and wetlands that they live in, and they prevent the spread of disease and bacteria. So they keep our waterways really, really clear, and we need them for us to be healthy and for our habitats and Canada's habitats to be healthy where they live. So it'd be really cool for this work to kind of help change people's perceptions about some of these species. But also, sorry for the long answer here, moving forward with what to do with these conservation work, we hope that this work assists conservationists with some difficult decisions that they have to make here, right? A lot of conservation organizations, like most nonprofits and charities, especially at the moment, are working with limited resources, and they're having to make decisions on how to allocate these resources to best achieve their goals. And we're in this unfortunate reality right now where there's too many at-risk species with the resources conservation organizations have to attend to them immediately all at once. And so conservationists are having to make really difficult decisions on what species they should prioritize conservation attention to first. And so we hope that these lists provide some additional and helpful information when they're making these really hard choices on what species to save. It can be used alongside like conservation risk status. So if a conservationist is deciding between two species that are equally at risk and maybe like equally potential, the recoveries are potentially the same, maybe this additional information can be that deciding factor on what species they want to invest conservation attention towards immediately or first moving forward. I think this is very new work, so hopefully that people kind of start to hear about it, and if they hear of any species that they are interested in that they never heard of before, that I hope it inspires them to kind of go out there and continue learning about that species and how it's important in Canada's history. We have some really cool species here that are also some of their only kind in the world. Another really unique species is the mountain beaver. It's not like a beaver you would traditionally think of. It's a rodent with very primitive features that there's no other one like them. They have very ancestral traits, which make them very unique, and they are another at-risk species here in Canada. And we also have the only two-tailed frogs in the world that live in Canada that are the second and third most isolated amphibian in Canada, as well as the top 10 globally in the world. And they are both at risk here in Canada as well. So we have some incredible, unique wildlife that I hope these lists encourage people to explore and learn about.
Well, I've already looked up Nycteris maculatus, the common mudpuppy. I know I have learned about them at some point in my life, but they have not been on my mind in such a long time. And with the information I've learned through this career change I made 10 years ago, moving into the wildlife world, it's exciting to be able to learn more about, and creating the opportunity to learn, I think, is also very important. And that's what you're doing with something like this. So as someone who enjoys learning about wildlife and biodiversity, thank you. It's an exciting project to be able to look at and sort of keep on hand for, as you said, there's other decisions that need to be made, or we're trying to understand how things interact. It's a great reference point for a lot of that. So it's definitely exciting. And I think a lot of folks are going to feel that way.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, it's definitely something that we are all feeling. This project has shown me animals that I had never heard of before, too, and that I didn't know existed here in Canada. So it's really expanded my appreciation of Canadian wildlife, and I hope it does that to everyone else here in Canada as well.
Links to the study and various write-ups on it are available in the show notes for this week's episode in your podcast player and at defenderradio.com. I want to thank Emma for joining us and all the great work her team did on this project. Were you surprised by any of the results? Let me know on Instagram at HowieMichael, Blue Sky at Defender Radio, or on the Defender Radio Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and remember to follow the show on your preferred podcast player to get notified when new episodes become available. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.